She was hired to clean his floors. He was built to rule empires. But the night he looked at her, really looked, something ancient cracked open inside the most dangerous man in Seoul. She had no idea that walking through his door would mean walking into the eye of a storm that would strip them both bare. He was ice. She was fire. And when those two forces collide, nothing survives unchanged. Not kingdoms. Not carefully built walls. Not hearts that swore they would never, ever fall. Welcome, fam. Please like, share, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Her name was Zuri. Zuri Adiz Okafor, 26 years old, 5'5" of stubborn ambition wrapped in soft brown skin, and a work uniform 2 sizes too small because the agency had run out of her size, and she had bills to pay, and pride was a luxury she could not afford right now. She had arrived in Seoul 18 months ago chasing a scholarship that fell through and stayed because going back home empty-handed felt worse than the cold. She cleaned offices on weekdays, waitressed on weekends, and sent money home every month without fail because her mother's arthritis medication didn't pay for itself, and her younger brother's school fees had a way of arriving with perfect, punishing regularity. She had not come to Seoul looking for trouble. Trouble, however, had a way of finding her anyway. The Han Group residence was not like the other properties on her cleaning roster. Zuri knew that the moment the black SUV arrived to collect her instead of the usual taxi voucher. The agency coordinator had called her personally, which never happened, and her voice had a careful, practiced quality to it, the kind of voice people used when they were about to ask you to do something that required specific courage. "We need someone reliable, Ms. Okafor. Someone discreet. The regular team has been reassigned. It is only for a few weeks, until permanent staff are sourced. The pay is triple your standard rate. Do not ask questions that are not related to your duties. Triple her standard rate." Zuri had agreed before the woman finished the sentence. She did not know who Han Sung-joon was. Not really. She had heard the name the way one hears thunder before seeing lightning, distantly, abstractly, as a fact of the atmosphere rather than something with the capacity to destroy you personally. She knew he was wealthy. She knew the Han Group had its hands in construction, logistics, and things that people in certain neighborhoods referred to only with lowered voices and careful pauses. She had assumed she would clean rooms and leave and never see the man himself.
She was wrong about that.
The residence sat behind gates that required 2 separate clearances to enter, perched on a hillside in Songbuk-dong where the houses did not announce themselves to the street but simply existed in a kind of immovable, ancient authority. The building was all dark stone and floor-to-ceiling glass, traditional Korean architectural bones dressed in something cold and modern, like a dynasty trying to survive the future. A woman named Ms. Park met Zuri at the entrance. Small, precise, efficient in the way of someone who had long ago decided that warmth was a wasted resource. She handed Zuri a laminated card with room assignments, a cleaning schedule, and a list of 12 rules in Korean and English. Rule 7 read, "You do not enter the East Wing without direct instruction." Rule 9. You do not speak to the director unless he addresses you first. Rule 12, underlined twice. You do not look directly at the director's face. Zuri stared at Rule 12 for a long moment. Then she tucked the card into her pocket and said nothing, because triple pay, and because her mother's medication, and because she was not in the habit of being told she could not look at someone's face and actually complying with it. She started on the lower floors. The residence was immaculate in the way that places tended to be when someone with unlimited resources and no tolerance for disorder had designed them. Dark wood floors, white stone surfaces, artwork on the walls that she suspected cost more than her entire hometown combined. She cleaned efficiently, methodically, the way she did everything, with her full attention and her back straight and her mind organized into neat, manageable compartments. She was on her knees scrubbing the base of the kitchen island, reaching into a corner that clearly nobody had touched in some time because even immaculate houses had their neglected corners, when she heard footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of house staff. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. The footsteps of someone who had never in their life been required to move fast for another person. Zuri did not look up. The footsteps stopped. She felt the silence change texture. It went from empty to occupied in a way that had nothing to do with sound. She kept scrubbing, because Rule 12, because her bills, because she was not going to be rattled by expensive shoes on a dark wood floor. Spread your legs wide. The voice came from directly above her, and it was low and controlled, the kind of voice that did not rise or fall with emotion but simply occupied space with total authority, and Zuri's hand stopped moving entirely. She looked up. Han Sung-joon was not what she had constructed in her imagination. She had imagined someone softer, the way money sometimes made men soft, buffered from the edges of the world by enough zeros.
He was not soft.
He was tall and lean with sharp features and dark eyes that were currently looking not at her, but at the cabinet panel behind her, the one whose base had been damaged by water and whose legs had bowed outward, pushing the cabinet away from the wall and creating a gap that she was currently wedged into at an angle that required her knees to be parted to maintain her balance. "Spread your legs wider," he said, his tone exactly as it would be if he were discussing weather. "The cabinet base is warped. You need more reach to clean properly behind it. I will have maintenance fix it this week." He looked down at her then, and that was when it happened. Not slowly, not romantically. It hit them both like a physical force, the way a door swings open in a gust and takes out everything in its path. His eyes, which had been moving with professional assessment across the space, landed on her face and stopped. Just stopped. Like a clock that had been running for years without incident and suddenly, inexplicably, ceased. Zuri stared back at him, because Rule 12 had apparently not survived contact with actual proximity, and because his face was, she could find no more useful word for it, arresting. Not traditionally beautiful. Too hard for that. Too angular, with something in his expression that suggested he had decided very long ago that the world did not deserve the softness he had buried somewhere underneath. But his eyes were doing something she could not categorize and could not look away from. He was the first to break it. He looked away, and the motion was too precise, too controlled, the kind of effort that only gets made when not making it would reveal something. "The grout on the left side needs attention as well," he said and walked out. Zuri sat with her knees spread wide on a billionaire's kitchen floor and stared at the space he had vacated and tried to remember what she was supposed to be doing. It took her longer than it should have. The next day, she arrived to find the cabinet had already been fixed. Not scheduled for the week. Fixed. Overnight. New hardware, the base realigned, the gap closed. She stared at it for a moment, and then opened her supply kit and got to work, because she was not the kind of woman who read things into things that had perfectly reasonable explanations. She cleaned for 6 hours without incident. She was reorganizing the supply closet near the third-floor landing when she heard voices from the room at the end of the hall. The door was partially open. She should not have been able to hear clearly. The other voice was male, older, and unhappy. He was speaking Korean too fast for her limited vocabulary to follow, but the cadence was unmistakable, the cadence of someone issuing a demand they expected to be obeyed. Han Sung-joon's response was 3 words, measured, absolute, and then silence. The older man left 2 minutes later, walking past the supply closet with his jaw locked and his eyes forward, and Zuri pressed herself back against the shelves and stayed very still until his footsteps disappeared. She stepped back into the hallway. Han Sung-joon was standing in the doorway of the room, and she discovered in that moment that surprise had a particular way of disassembling his face. For exactly 2 seconds, before the control returned, he looked like a man who had not expected to find her there and did not entirely mind that he had. "You were here long," he said. She met his eyes. "The supply closet needed organizing, Director Han." His head tilted slightly. Almost imperceptibly. It was, she would realize much later, a gesture he made when something surprised him and intrigued him in the same breath. "The East Wing," he said, "needs attention tomorrow. Ms. Park will update your schedule." He went back inside and closed the door. Zuri walked down the stairs with her supply kit and a heartbeat that was behaving in ways she categorically refused to examine. The East Wing was not like the rest of the house. The other floors were cold and architectural, designed to impress rather than inhabit. The East Wing was lived in. The desk was occupied with papers and books stacked in a system that only made sense to one specific mind. A suit jacket lay over the back of a chair instead of hung properly. The window behind the desk was the only one in the house that faced the mountains directly, and someone had been in the habit of sitting in front of it for long periods because the floor there was worn slightly, just a fraction, in a way that spoke of years. She cleaned carefully, touching nothing that was not a surface, disturbing nothing in the organized chaos of his desk. She was dusting the bookshelf along the far wall when she noticed the photograph. Small, framed, set back behind a row of books so it was not immediately visible but had clearly been placed with intention. A boy, 6 or 7 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, sitting on the shoulders of a younger Han Sung-joon who was also, remarkably, smiling. She picked it up without thinking. The boy had his eyes. She set it back exactly where she found it and went back to the shelf and said nothing to anyone and filed it into the compartment in her mind labeled things that are not your business, and kept it there mostly. 3 days later, Zuri arrived at the residence to find 2 black sedans parked at angles she associated with urgency rather than arrangement. Miss Park met her at the door with a face that was managing controlled alarm with professional difficulty. "You will work in the kitchen today only, Ms. Okafor. Do not come above the ground floor under any circumstances." She paused, then added, with the specific emphasis of someone who actually meant it, "Do you understand?" Zuri understood. She cleaned the kitchen. She made herself unremarkable and quiet and efficient. She was filling the cleaning bucket at the sink when she heard it, a heavy sound from above, the unmistakable particular weight of a body impacting a wall, and then a voice she recognized even through the floor speaking in a tone she had not heard from him before. Not the controlled quiet. Something underneath it. Something that sounded like fury barely contained by the thinnest membrane of civilization. Then the sound of glass. Then nothing. She turned off the sink and stood with her wet hands and waited and told herself it was nothing to do with her. 40 minutes later, Han Sung-joon walked into the kitchen. He had a cut along his jaw, already cleaned but fresh, and his shirt was rolled to the elbows in a way that suggested the situation had required his physical involvement. His face had returned to its customary arrangement of controlled composure, but his eyes were still carrying something unprocessed, something he hadn't yet found a place to put. He looked at her as if he had forgotten she was scheduled to be here today and had arrived specifically because he had. She said nothing. She went back to the bucket. He sat down at the kitchen island. He poured himself a glass of water from the carafe and drank half of it and set the glass down and sat very still, and Zuri cleaned around him with a complete absence of comment that was, she suspected, the thing he had actually come here looking for. After 12 minutes, he said, without preamble, "Do you have family at home?" She wrung out the cloth. "A mother. A brother." He was quiet. Then, "You send the money." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Every month." Another silence. He looked at his glass. The cut on his jaw caught the light. "They're lucky," he said, and the texture of the words was different from his usual register. Unguarded in a way that seemed to happen outside his awareness. To have someone who does that. Zuri looked at him then, because she could not quite help it, and what she saw on his face was not the director of the Han group. It was someone who had sat in front of a window facing the mountains for years and worn the floor down and kept a photograph behind a row of books where visitors wouldn't see it. She said the only true thing that seemed appropriate. "It is not luck. It is just love." He looked at her. The kitchen held its breath. He stood up, took his glass to the sink, rinsed it with the particular care of someone who had been raised with specific standards, set it on the drying rack, and left the kitchen without another word. Zuri stared at the glass on the drying rack for a long moment. She was in a great deal of trouble. She knew it with the clarity of someone standing at the edge of something steep, looking down, fully aware that the ground below was very far away and that gravity had already made its decision regardless of hers. She put her cloth in the bucket, picked it up, and went back to work because her mother's medication and her brother's school fees, and because some edges you stare at and then you take 3 careful steps back and you do not look again. She took 3 careful steps back. She did not stop looking. The following week, a man named Kwon arrived. Zuri did not know who he was at first. She knew only that he was tall in a performative way, the way some men were tall as a statement rather than a fact, and that he smiled at her for precisely 3 seconds too long when Ms. Park introduced the visiting contractors to the staff. He was from the logistics division, Ms. Park said. Here to review the residential security arrangements. He found reasons to be near the kitchen. The second day, he brought her coffee from the cafe down the hill, her exact order, which meant he had asked someone, which meant he had been paying a specific and deliberate kind of attention. "Thank you," she said, politely and briefly, and set it on the counter and went back to work. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her with the expression of a man who considered persistence a form of flattery. "You work very hard," he said. "Most people do," she said. He laughed. She did not. By the third day, his visits to the kitchen had a rhythm to them, and Zuri navigated them with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her adult life managing unwanted attention without creating incidents in spaces where she needed to keep her job. She was focused on the pantry shelves when she heard Kwon behind her, closer than she had registered, his voice dropping to the particular low register that men used when they had decided that proximity was a prelude. "You know," he said, "I could make things easier for you here. Better assignments, more flexibility." She turned around, and he was closer than she wanted, and her face said everything her mouth did not. "Step back, please," she said, and her voice was quiet and absolute, the voice she reserved for moments when politeness had used up its usefulness. He did not step back. The pantry door opened. Han Sung-joon did not raise his voice. He did not cross the room. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at Kwon with an expression that had no heat in it, which made it far more dangerous than heat would have been, and he said 2 words in Korean that Zuri did not know but that drained the color from Kwon's face with surgical efficiency. Kwon left the pantry. He left the kitchen. He was gone from the residence by noon, and Zuri never saw him again. Han Sung-joon stood in the pantry doorway for a moment after. He was looking at a point just past her shoulder, the particular evasion of a man who has done something that revealed more than he intended. "Your schedule has been adjusted," he said finally. "You will finish 2 hours earlier today. Ms. Park will arrange transport." He left before she could respond. Zuri stood among the shelves with her heart performing its new, inexplicable rhythm, and thought about the expression on his face in the doorway. Not anger. Not the performed authority of a powerful man enforcing his territory. Something else. Something that moved beneath the surface of him like current under ice, purposeful and barely contained. Something that looked, she thought, dangerously close to feeling. A few days later, she arrived for her shift to find a new uniform waiting at the staff entrance. Her actual size. Pressed, professional, clearly not sourced from the agency's depleted stock. There was no note. There was no explanation. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands and felt the particular weight of something that had been chosen for her rather than assigned. She put it on. She did not mention it to anyone. At noon, she was cleaning the hallway outside the East Wing when a phone rang inside, and Han Sung-joon answered it, and the conversation was brief, but his voice carried enough through the door for her to hear the shift in it. The tone that came in when business became something more personal, more urgent, more saturated with consequence. When he emerged, he nearly walked into her. They both stopped. The hallway was narrow. He was close enough that she could see the line of tension in his jaw and the faint shadow beneath his eyes that spoke of nights not fully slept. His gaze dropped briefly to the uniform, then back up. Something crossed his face that he collected and put away too fast for her to name. "The East Wing again tomorrow," he said. "Early." She nodded. He moved past her, and the air in his wake carried the scent of cedar and something warmer underneath it, and Zuri pressed herself against the wall and waited until his footsteps receded, and then stood in the hallway and breathed carefully and reminded herself of all the reasons why she was here and what she had to lose and how entirely insufficient it would be to let this particular feeling have any real estate in her life. She was largely unconvincing. That evening, walking to the transport vehicle, she passed the garden on the east side of the house. Han Sung-joon was standing at the edge of it, phone to his ear, head slightly bowed, his posture carrying the specific weight of someone delivering or receiving news that required physical bracing. He looked up and saw her. He said something brief into the phone, then lowered it. The light was going. The garden was full of the particular gold and shadow of late afternoon, the kind of light that had no respect for professional distance or appropriate boundaries. He looked at her the way he had in the kitchen the first time. That stopping look, complete and unguarded. Zuri looked back. She raised one hand in a small, simple wave, not coy, not performing, just a human acknowledgement of a human being, and kept walking. She did not see his face change. But behind her, she heard him exhale. Long, slow, the release of something held too tightly for too long. She kept walking, and she did not smile until she was in the SUV and the gate had closed behind her, and even then she kept it small, pressed against the inside of her cheek, where nobody could see it. The following morning brought fog and a name she had not heard before. Park Sung-chul. She heard it first from two of the household staff speaking in the kitchen when they didn't know she was in the laundry alcove folding linen. The name had weight when they said it. The specific gravity of someone who occupied a significant position in whatever the Han group was, in the official version, and the unofficial one that ran beneath it like a river under stone. Park Sung-chul was coming for a meeting. The staff had been on alert since early morning. Ms. Park moved through the house with attention that had nothing to do with scheduling. Zuri worked quietly on the lower floors and did not concern herself with it. She was scrubbing the exterior step near the side entrance when the cars arrived, 3 of them, black and unhurried. Men in suits moved with the particular choreography of security personnel, efficient and unhurried, and covering everything. Then Park Sung-chul himself, and he was older than she expected, silver-haired, with the polished surface of a man who had made his peace with whatever compromises had gotten him to this level. He saw her on the step.
He stopped.
His eyes moved over her with an assessment that had nothing professional in it, and he smiled the way some men smile when they think they are charming and have never been corrected. He said something to the man beside him. The man translated. He says, he is not aware that Director Han employs such beautiful staff. Zuri looked at the translator. Please tell him thank you, and please ask him to keep moving. The translator's eyes widened. He did not translate this. Park Sung-chul said something else, still smiling, and stepped closer. The front door of the residence opened. Han Sung-joon stood on the threshold, and he was looking at Park Sung-chul with the particular quality of stillness that Zuri had learned, in the weeks she had spent in this house, was the most dangerous thing about him. He was always still when he was most dangerous. Stillness was how he contained the thing underneath. He said 3 sentences in Korean. His voice did not rise. His face did not shift. But Park Sung-chul's smile disappeared, and he turned from Zuri and walked toward the entrance with the brisk deliberateness of a man recalculating. Han Sung-joon held the door. His eyes met Zuri's over Sung-chul's shoulder. In his gaze was something so unambiguous that it required no translation across any language gap. Something possessive and furious, and barely wearing its mask. He looked away first. He went inside. Zuri picked up her bucket with hands that were entirely steady and kept her face completely composed and walked around to the service entrance and stood in the laundry alcove for 3 minutes doing absolutely nothing because she needed 3 minutes to put herself back together, and even then she was not entirely sure she managed it. That night, she was preparing to leave when Miss Park appeared at the service entrance with an expression that had moved from managed alarm to something quieter, and extended an envelope. From Director Han, Miss Park said. She did not explain. She left. Zuri opened the envelope in the transport vehicle. Inside was a single card, the Han Group letterhead, a short paragraph in Han Sung-joon's handwriting. Your contract has been extended by personal request. Your rate has been adjusted. I am aware this is outside your original arrangement with the agency. You are under no obligation to accept. The decision is entirely yours. Below that, a mobile number. And below that, 6 words, written with the careful deliberation of someone who had written and discarded several versions before arriving at the one that said the most while asking for the least. I would prefer that you stay. Zuri sat in the back of the SUV as it moved through Seoul's evening traffic and read those 6 words 4 times. Then she put the card in her pocket, against her chest, where it stayed warm from her skin for the rest of the ride home. She called the number in the morning. He answered on the second ring. She had expected Miss Park. Director Han. She heard him breathe in the particular way of someone working hard to sound unaffected. Ms. Okafor. She said, I'll stay. A pause. Very small. But there. Then good. 2 syllables. Good. But the exhale that followed it was not small and not controlled and spoke, very clearly, of a man who had spent the night hoping she would say exactly that. She hung up and stood in her small apartment and let herself feel the full electric weight of what she was walking back into.
She went back.
The days that followed had a different quality. He found reasons to be in the room she was cleaning. Not obtrusively. Not with performance. He would come with documents or his phone and station himself near a window and work, and they would exist in the same space, and gradually the silence between them developed a texture that was not empty at all. It was inhabited.
Shared.
The particular comfort of 2 people who had independently decided that the other one's presence was where the tension went out of their shoulders. He learned that she hummed when she was concentrating. Low, rhythmic, just above silence. Some days it was something he didn't recognize, something with the cadence of a language he didn't know. He did not ask what it was. He listened with the careful attention of someone collecting something precious. She learned that he kept a specific mug near the east wing window and refilled it 3 times in an afternoon when something was weighing on him. She learned that he stood very still when people tried to read him, but moved his hands slightly when he was thinking something through. She learned that the photograph behind the books was a son. She knew this because on the 4th week, he came into the east wing while she was cleaning and stood near the bookshelf for a long moment, and when she looked at him his face had the open, broken quality of grief that does not make appointments. She said nothing. She finished the shelf and moved to the window and cleaned the glass with long, steady strokes. He said, behind her. He would have been 12 this year. She did not turn around. She kept moving the cloth on the glass. She said, what was his name? Junwoo. His voice was very quiet. He liked loud music and terrible jokes and was afraid of nothing except spiders. She smiled, still facing the glass. Sounds exhausting. He made a sound that might have been almost a laugh.
He was.
Outside, the mountains did what they always did, indifferent and magnificent, and Zuri cleaned the window until it was perfect, and they stayed in that room together for another 20 minutes and did not speak again, and it was the most significant conversation either of them would have that year. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. It arrived in the form of a woman named Soyan, who was connected to the Han family by the particular thread of obligation and history that powerful families used to bind themselves to each other, and who appeared at the residence with the proprietary ease of someone who had been told, at some point, that she had standing here. She was beautiful in the architectural way of women who had been raised to understand their beauty as a strategic resource. She moved through the residence with fluid confidence. She looked at the staff the way some people looked at furniture, necessary and largely invisible.
Until she saw Zuri.
Zuri was descending the main staircase with supplies when Soyan looked up from the foyer below, and the pleasant blankness of her expression sharpened into something else entirely. She spoke to Ms. Park in Korean, too quick for Zuri to follow. Ms. Park's response was careful, the tone of someone deflecting without conceding. Soyan looked up at Zuri again and smiled. It was the kind of smile that went nowhere near the eyes and said, very clearly and without any ambiguity at all, I see what you are doing here, and I am not remotely threatened, but I am filing it away, and I will use it when I need to. Zuri came down the stairs at the same measured pace, and went about her work and did not react to any of it. She was good at not reacting. She had spent her adult life being the person in the room who people needed to see be unfazed. But her hands, when she got to the laundry room, needed a moment before she trusted them to fold things properly. Han Sung-joon did not seek her out that afternoon. She told herself this was normal. She told herself the prickling feeling at the back of her chest was nothing but the natural discomfort of a complicated situation that did not involve her. She was halfway to the service entrance when Miss Park appeared and said, with the tone of someone delivering a message verbatim, Director Han asks that you not depart by the service exit this evening. The car is at the main gate. Zuri stopped. The main gate was for guests and family. Staff used the service entrance. She went to the main gate. The SUV was there. And standing beside it, in his coat, with his hands in his pockets and the particular deliberate quality of someone who has been waiting, was Han Sung-joon. He looked at her. Something in his face was different tonight. More present. Less managed. The thing under the ice was closer to the surface.
She had a good day, he said. Soyan.
She is good at appearing comfortable. Zuri did not have a response to this that would not reveal too much. She is a guest in your home, she said carefully. I hope she is comfortable. His eyes held hers. She is not a guest who is welcome. She is a guest who arrived. There is a difference. The evening air was cold between them, and the streetlights had come on, and Han Sung-joon was standing very close to the open car door and looking at her with the expression of a man who is running out of reasons to maintain a particular distance. He said, I want to make sure you are not given the wrong impression.
About anything, she said. What impression would that be?
And he looked at her for a long, careful moment, and something passed between them that was not words and was not touch but had the weight of both, and then he said, very quietly, that this is ordinary for me. Any of this. Because it is not. She got into the car. She kept her face composed until the window was up. She sat in the back of the SUV as it moved through the lit city, and she pressed her fingers against the card in her pocket, still there, still warm, and she thought about a man who had worn a floor down staring at mountains and kept his grief behind books so visitors wouldn't see it, and who had just told her, in the most precise language available to him, that she mattered. She stared out the window at Seoul moving past in its beautiful, indifferent brightness, and she let herself feel it. Just for the length of the ride home. All of it, the magnitude, and the warmth and the terror. Then she got out of the car, went inside and made herself tea, and sat with her hands wrapped around the mug, and thought, I am in so much trouble. She was right. The danger, when it came quietly. They usually did. Zuri had been at the Han residence for 6 weeks when Miss Park appeared at her elbow during the morning briefing with a face so carefully neutral it communicated alarm more effectively than panic would have. There were guests coming this evening, she said. Important ones. The kind whose names were not written on any legitimate ledger. Zuri was to finish her shift by 4 and leave by the service exit and not return until Monday. Zuri agreed. She finished her assigned rooms, collected her things, and was leaving through the second-floor corridor when a door at the far end opened and Han Sung-joon stepped out, followed by 2 men who wore their tension in their shoulders and scanned every doorway on instinct. He saw her. The men looked at her with a brief, assessing efficiency of security professionals deciding whether she was a risk. Whatever they concluded, they kept moving. Han Sung-joon said something brief, and they continued without him. He crossed the corridor to her. His face was doing the managed thing again, the controlled composure that she had learned to read in the spaces around its edges, and the edges tonight were fraying in a way she had not seen before.
You should not still be here, he said.
I was leaving. She held up her kit as evidence. He looked at it, then at her face. He said, there are people coming tonight who have an interest in everything I own. My properties. My accounts. The people who work for me. She understood the shape of what he was saying without the explicit statement. I will leave, she said. I will be back Monday. He said, go home. Lock your door tonight. She looked at him. The fraying edges. The photograph behind the books. The mug refilled 3 times. She said, who are they? His jaw moved. A faction. People who believe that the Han Group's continued independence represents a problem for their interests. We have been negotiating. Negotiations have not gone well. She held his gaze. Are you safe tonight? He looked at her as if the question had arrived from a direction he had not anticipated. His expression opened for just a moment, the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long, and she saw something in him that was very young and very tired and profoundly unused to being asked that particular question. He said, go home, Zuri. Her name. For the first time. Not Ms. Okafor.
Zuri.
She went home. She locked her door. She lay on her bed in the dark and listened to the city and thought about the way he had said her name, all 6 weeks of careful professional distance collapsing in 2 syllables. She did not sleep until almost 4 in the morning. She did not go back Monday. She went back Sunday because at 11 o'clock Saturday night her phone rang with a number she did not recognize and she answered it, and a voice she did not know said, in English with a Korean accent, Ms. Okafor. I am calling on behalf of Director Han. There has been an incident. He is asking that you come. She was in the SUV 20 minutes later. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. The residence was lit differently at night. The soft, curated warmth of the interior felt different in darkness, more exposing, the light pushing back against something the dark outside was pressing in. 2 men in suits at the main gate. More inside. The particular choreography of aftermath. Ms. Park met her at the door. She looked like someone who had aged 5 years since Friday. She said, "He is in the East Wing. He asked specifically for you."
I do not know why.
I did not question it. Zuri went upstairs. Han Sung-jun was sitting at his desk with his jacket off and his left arm bandaged from wrist to elbow, a bandage that had been applied with medical efficiency and was currently demonstrating that efficiency had its limits. His face was composed. His eyes, when he looked up as she entered, were not. She set her things down. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him and looked at the arm and at his face and said, "How bad?" He said, "It required stitching." She said, "How many?" He said, 14. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat down directly across from him, close enough that their knees were nearly touching, and looked at his face for a long moment. He looked back. The managed composure was entirely absent. There was nothing between them now but what was actually there. She said, "Tell me what happened." He told her. Not all of it, not the details that required protection, but the shape of it, the broad strokes of a confrontation that had gone further than anticipated and required responses he had not fully planned for, and as he spoke his voice remained level but his hands, resting on the desk, were not fully steady, and she recognized this as the decompression of someone who has been holding something at bay through pure will and has just now, in this room, with this person, allowed the hold to release. She said nothing while he talked. She sat with him. This was, she had learned in 26 years of being alive and being the person people came to, sometimes the only thing that was needed.
To be sat with.
When he finished, he looked at her and said, "You came back on a Sunday." She said, "You asked." He said, "I should not have called you. It was not appropriate." It was. She said, "It was right." She said it quietly and completely, without performance or equivocation, and something in his face did a slow, irrevocable thing. He reached across the desk. His right hand, his good hand, and he placed it over hers, very carefully, the way people touch things they are afraid of breaking. Neither of them moved. The East Wing was entirely quiet. Somewhere outside, Seoul was doing what Seoul did, endlessly restless, endlessly loud, and in here there was only the warm light and 2 people sitting very still with their hands touching. He said, "I have not wanted anyone in this room in 4 years." She understood what 4 years meant. Junwoo, who would have been 12. She turned her hand over and held his. She felt his breath change.
He looked at their hands.
Then at her face. The thing that had been building since the first day in the kitchen, since the uniform, since the 6 words on the card, since the mountain light in the garden. It was all in his face now, and he was not trying to manage it. He said, "Zuri." Just her name. Again. But this time it was not a dismissal. It was an arrival. She leaned forward. He leaned forward. They met somewhere in the middle, and the first time he kissed her it was not tentative. It was the kiss of someone who has been making a decision for a long time and has finally stopped arguing with himself about it. It was careful and searching, and then not careful at all, and she held his face in both her hands and kissed him back with everything she had been quietly carrying for 6 weeks. The light in the East Wing stayed on for a long time. Later, much later, when the city outside had gone quiet and the house had settled into its nighttime stillness, she lay beside him in the dark listening to him breathe and felt the particular vertigo of a life that has turned a corner so completely that the way back is no longer visible. He was asleep with one arm around her and his face, in sleep, was stripped of everything, the authority, the management, the weight of whatever he carried. He looked, in sleep, like the man in the photograph with the gap-toothed boy on his shoulders. She studied him for a long time. Then she got up. She was not running. She was not. She sat in the kitchen in the dark with her hands around a glass of cold water and told herself this very firmly. She was not the kind of woman who ran from things. She was the kind of woman who stayed, who cleaned, who organized her life into manageable components and got them done. But the magnitude of what had happened had its own weight and its own fear, and the specific fear had a shape she knew well. He would wake up and the composure would return, and he would look at her with the professional care of a man who had made an error and was now calibrating the correction, and she would have to be the version of herself that was fine with that took it cleanly, and she was not sure she had that particular version of herself available tonight. So she sat in the kitchen in the dark. She did not run. She just sat very still and prepared herself for what waking up was going to feel like. She heard him before she saw him. The footsteps on the stairs, unhurried. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in a t-shirt and bare feet, his hair loose, his expression impossible to read in the dim light. He looked at her. He looked at the glass of water. He looked at her again. He said, "You were going to leave." She said, "I was in the kitchen." He said, "You were deciding whether to leave." She looked down. She said, "I didn't want to be a situation that needed managing in the morning." He was very quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her and put his arms on the table and leaned forward until she had no choice but to look at him. He said, "I am going to say something and I need you to hear all of it." She looked at him. "I have not been afraid of anything in 4 years," he said. "I built something from fear so that I would not have to feel it. I became someone who could not be touched because I could not survive being touched and losing again."
He paused.
He looked at their hands on the table, not touching yet, an inch apart. "You are the first thing in 4 years that has frightened me. Not because I think you will hurt me. Because you make me want things I stopped permitting myself to want, and it is very frightening, Zuri." She said nothing. Her throat was not fully cooperating. He said, "I do not want to manage this. I want to be in it. With you.
If you will let me."
She sat in Han Sung-jun's kitchen in the dark and felt the last of the careful distance she had been maintaining fold up entirely, quietly, without resistance. She reached across the table and took his hand. She said, "I am frightened too." He exhaled. He tightened his hand around hers. He said, "Good. Let's be frightened together." What followed was not simple. Nothing that matters is. The Han group's internal power struggle came to a head in the weeks after, and the faction that had sent men to their residence on Thursday escalated their methods. A car was followed. One of Sung-jun's directors received a threat with specific details that were possible only from an internal source. The house in Songbukdong was placed under elevated security, and Zuri, who was not and would not be a secret, became a target. She did not know this until the morning she stepped out of her apartment building and found 2 men she had never seen before standing at the entrance of the alley. They did not speak to her. They simply watched, with the particular quality of watchers who want to be noticed who are making a point with their presence. She called Sung-jun from the lobby of her building, her voice steady. "There are 2 men outside my building." She described them with the specific detail of someone who had spent 6 weeks learning to pay attention to things. He was already moving before she finished the sentence. She could hear it, the shift in ambient sound, the door, the voices giving instructions. He said, "Do not go outside. Do not go to the residence. I am coming to you." He arrived in 30 minutes. The men outside her building were gone before he got there. His people had handled that, but he came anyway. He came in off hours, in a car that was not his usual, and he was in her small apartment for the first time, and he looked around at the organized efficiency of it, the photographs of her family on the wall, the African print cloth draped over the chair, the medical receipts stacked neatly on the counter, and his face moved with something that was grief and respect and a very deep, specific fury. He said, "You have been here alone this whole time." She said, "I am always alone." "It is fine." He said, "It is not fine." His voice was quiet, but the quietness contained something enormous. "None of this is fine. You should not have been exposed to this." She said, "I knew what your world was. He said, "You knew what my world was from the outside. This is different. This is them reaching into your space. I will not allow that." She crossed her arms. "Sungjun." He looked at her. She said, "I am not a person you protect by making decisions for. I am a person you protect by telling me the truth and planning with me." He held her gaze. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working against his instinct. Then he nodded. One short, genuine nod. He sat down at her small table. He told her everything. The faction, their leverage, their current strategy. The internal source who had been identified and was being handled. The timeline for resolution. He talked to her as an equal and a partner, and not as someone to be organized away from danger. She listened. She asked questions. Sharp ones. He answered them. By the end, the fury in his face had been joined by something else. Something that looked like relief. Like the particular relief of a person who has been alone with something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. She said, "What do you need?" He looked at her and said, "I need you to come to the residence. I need you where I can see you. I need to know you are safe." She said, "I need it not to be about cleaning anymore." He said immediately, "It has not been about cleaning for a long time." She moved in that night. The resolution came swiftly once Sungjun moved. The internal source was removed. The faction's leverage disappeared in a series of very quiet legal and financial maneuvers that suggested someone had been preparing for exactly this contingency for months. Park Sung-chul, who had been the faction's primary front, found himself facing 17 regulatory violations simultaneously and subsequently discovered that Seoul in January was a very good time to take an extended vacation to somewhere with no extradition treaty. The final meeting was with the faction's remaining leadership in a room in the Han Group's building that Zuri was not in and did not ask about the details of afterward. He came home that evening and found her in the kitchen, cooking, because she had decided that the Han residence was going to have meals that actually smelled like a home instead of catering, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a long moment without announcing himself. She said, without turning, "How long have you been standing there?" He said, "Long enough." She turned. He was still in his coat, just inside the doorway, and he was looking at her with his whole face, nothing managed, nothing controlled. "Just him." He said, "It's over." She crossed the kitchen. She put her arms around him and he pulled her in, his face against her hair, and they stood in the middle of the kitchen she had cleaned 100 times before it became the place where they cooked dinner together, and he held her with a specific grip of someone who has been braced against losing for so long that having is almost disorienting. She said into his shoulder, "I made kimchi jjigae. I called your mother for the recipe." He stilled. "His mother?" She said. "She was very helpful. She talked for 45 minutes. She also wants to know why you haven't called." He laughed. A real one, surprised out of him, low and warm, and she felt it against her scalp and held it in her chest like something she was going to keep. He proposed 3 months later, not in a restaurant or with an audience. In the East Wing, in the evening, with the window open to the mountains and the photograph of Junwoo on the shelf no longer behind the books but in front of them, where it belonged. He got down on one knee, which she would tease him about for the rest of their lives, and he said, "I spent 4 years deciding that the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. Then you came into my kitchen and looked directly at my face when I had specifically told staff not to do that." She laughed. He smiled, and it was the smile from the photograph. He said, "You made me want my life back. You gave me mine. I would very much like to give you something in return. All of it. Everything I have, and everything I am. For the rest of both of our lives." She said yes before he finished the sentence. She pulled him up and kissed him and held his face in her hands the way she had the first time, and he wrapped both arms around her and lifted her slightly off the floor, and outside the mountains were exactly as they always were, indifferent and magnificent, and inside, 2 people chose each other fully, and without reservation. They married in spring. Small, deliberate, with her mother and brother flown in from home, sitting in the front row of a ceremony in a garden full of flowers that Sungjun had personally approved because her mother had mentioned white lilies in passing, and he had written it down.
Zuri wore ivory.
She did not wear a uniform of any kind. She wore the dress she chose herself and the gold necklace she chose herself, and she walked toward the man who had gotten down on one knee in the East Wing and looked at her with everything he had. Her mother cried from the first word of the ceremony. Her brother tried not to and failed completely by the second. Sungjun, who did not cry in front of people, had been very much not crying for most of the morning, and then Zuri appeared at the end of the garden path, and something in his face simply gave way. He stood there in his dark suit and took the full impact of her like a man who had decided he no longer needed to brace for things. She reached him. He took her hands. She looked at his face, the whole unguarded weight of it, and thought about a woman on her knees on a kitchen floor 6 months ago who had been told not to look directly at the director's face. She looked directly at his face. He looked back. And that was that. Everything else, the vows, the rings, the celebration that ran until the small hours of the morning with her mother teaching his mother a dance that required no shared language whatsoever, all of it came after, and was wonderful. But the beginning was the look. It always had been. 7 months after the wedding, Zuri sat in the East Wing in the morning light with a glass of water she had not touched and a pregnancy test she had been staring at for 4 minutes. Sungjun appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, looked at her face, looked at the test in her hands, looked at her face again. He set the cups down. He crossed the room. He knelt in front of her chair, which he had done exactly once before and which she had told him looked ridiculous, and he took her hands in both of his. She said, "I know we did not plan this for." He said,
"Zuri." She stopped.
He said, "Look at my face." She looked at his face. It was completely open. No management, no composure, no controlled authority.
Just joy.
The specific, almost unbearable joy of a man who thought he was done with hoping and has been proven magnificently wrong. He said, "We're having a baby." She said, "We're having a baby." He pressed his forehead to her hands and stayed very still for a long moment, and she put her fingers in his hair, and outside the mountains held the city the way they always had, enormous and permanent. In the East Wing window, in the morning light, the photograph of Junwoo smiled from the shelf. And the floor, worn soft beneath the chair where a man had sat for 4 years waiting without knowing what he was waiting for, held them both.